My name is Margaret Ellison, and I am 62 years old. For most of my adult life, I believed I had a peaceful existence, quiet routines, a modest home, a steady job, and a marriage that I thought rested on solid ground. My husband, David, liked to say I was the anchor of the family, the one person everyone could depend on. And for decades, I took pride in that. Stability was my craft. But age gives you a strange kind of hindsight. It lets you look back at your life and realize that some of the small, odd moments were actually warnings you failed to read. A sigh here, a half-truth there, a pattern of discomfort you'd brushed off because it felt impolite to press too hard. My relationship with David's parents, Thomas and Elaine, was full of those quiet signals. I used to think their distance stemmed from personality differences. Elaine was a chronic worrier, always in some emotional storm of her own creation. Thomas liked control. He measured respect by how much unquestioning compliance you offered. Their son, my husband, learned early not to challenge them. I learned that later, when it became inconvenient. Still, when we were younger, we managed. Holidays were civil, polite, even warm at times. Once David and I settled into middle age and our finances stabilized, I found myself becoming the unofficial problem solver whenever his parents hit one of their periodic crises. A car breakdown, a medical bill not covered by insurance, a house repair they'd neglected for too long, a temporary shortfall that somehow always lingered. They always said, "We'll pay you back, Maggie. You're a lifesaver." And I would smile, because what else could I do? Family is complicated, and I never wanted to be the person who gated her compassion behind spreadsheets or insurance policies. But something changed after I retired early at 59. Maybe I'd been too accessible, too willing. Maybe they assumed I simply had more than I needed. Or maybe, and I believe this now, they assumed my quietness meant I wouldn't notice when things stopped adding up. The foreshadowing began 2 years ago, when David came home unusually tense after visiting his parents. He sat at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples with the heel of his hand. I asked what was wrong. He said nothing. He always said nothing when something was wrong. A week later, I found a note on his desk. $54,000, repay by June. At the time, I didn't understand what the number referred to. I assumed it was part of our retirement calculations. It didn't occur to me that the money was gone, that it had already left our account, transferred quietly in pieces to his parents during a period of helping them get through a rough patch. He didn't tell me. They didn't tell me. No one told me. And yet all three of them agreed, apparently, that the money was only borrowed. Temporary. A mere bump in the road. But bumps do not usually require 5 figures to fix. And temporary rarely stretches into the horizon without a single payment returning. Back then, I still trusted them, perhaps more than they deserved, but less than they assumed. I believed in reasonable explanations, in misunderstandings, in human error. But a strange feeling tugged at me in those early moments. A whisper at the back of my mind. This isn't small. This isn't normal. And this isn't the last time they hide something from you. I dismissed it, because love is stubborn, and because I didn't yet know the truth. The shock came on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was going through envelopes on the kitchen counter, routine mail, pension statements, dull bureaucratic paperwork, when I noticed one from our bank marked Account Activity Review. It wasn't addressed to me specifically. It was addressed to both me and David. Normally, I would have waited for him to come home before opening it, but something told me to look. Inside were summaries of transfers from the previous year. Large ones. Multiple ones. Tens of thousands of dollars being siphoned in chunks of $3,000, $5,000, $8,000. I sat down in silence, methodically tracing each movement. All of it went to one account, Thomas and Elaine Ellison. My breath went cold. $54,000 in total. It felt like the kitchen walls pressed inward. For a moment, I wondered whether I was having some sort of mental lapse. Had we discussed this? Had I forgotten? But no. I remember every financial conversation David and I ever had. I've always been the planner. I called him immediately. He didn't answer. I paced the living room for an hour before he finally walked in the door, lunch bag still in hand, eyes tired. "David," I said, holding the papers. "What is this?" He looked at the papers. Then at me. Then at the floor. "I was going to tell you," he whispered. "When?" My voice was deceptively calm. "When we ran out of money entirely?" He sat down, slumping like a defeated man. They needed help. Mom had medical expenses. Dad's truck broke down. They were behind on the mortgage. It was always one crisis after another. But they promised, Mom promised, they'd pay it back. All of it. They just needed time. Time. I repeated. David, this is our retirement savings. That's not time. That's our future. He tried to argue that he did it for family, that he didn't want to stress me, that he assumed his parents were good for their word. But when I asked if he had a repayment plan or any written acknowledgement, he fell silent. Silence is an answer. Later that week, we visited his parents to discuss the matter. I held onto a thin strand of hope that they would apologize, explain, offer clarity. Instead, I walked into a wall of entitlement so thick it shocked me. Elaine acted offended that I even brought it up. "We're your family, Maggie," she said, folding her arms like a scolded child. "We needed help. Isn't that what family does?" Thomas waved dismissively. "We said we'll pay it back. Don't act like we ran off with it." "You kind of did," I said quietly. Elaine's eyes hardened. "We're doing our best. Stop pressuring us." Pressuring? I had barely said 10 words. But that's when I noticed something else. They weren't struggling. Not anymore. The house had been repainted. Thomas had a new watch. Elaine had new dental work she hadn't been able to afford last year. They were eating well, living well, spending well. Meanwhile, David and I were down $54,000. The betrayal wasn't just the money. It was the deception, the entitlement, the casual expectation that we would absorb the financial blow like it meant nothing. And for the first time, I felt a slow, simmering anger that was not explosive but controlled. Precise. Focused. I wasn't going to let this slide. I've always believed that understanding someone's motives requires looking at their history. People rarely behave irrationally. Their choices usually trace back to old habits, old wounds, or old assumptions that never got challenged. So I began thinking back to the early years of my marriage. Thomas had always been proud, bordering on cocky. He liked to speak in declarations. "I know best. I've got it handled. I don't need anyone's help." Yet the irony was that he depended on others constantly. He called it borrowing, but in reality, his borrowing had no expiration date. When David was in his 20s, his father once borrowed $3,000 from him to cover an emergency. David never admitted the details, but he told me years later. Dad said it wasn't a loan. He said it was payback for raising me. That was the environment he grew up in, an emotional economy where his parents were always owed something. Elaine, on the other hand, was soft in demeanor but sharp in manipulation. She cried easily, pleaded convincingly, and always framed herself as the victim of life's unfairness. Even when things were objectively fine, she managed to paint herself as someone drowning. David never recognized the patterns. Children rarely do. And for years, I didn't challenge them because I believed in preservation, not conflict. My own upbringing taught me that peace was a choice, not an accident. My mother always said, "Choose your battles carefully, Margaret. Don't waste energy on storms that pass on their own." She wasn't wrong, but some storms aren't storms, they're patterns. So when I married David, I became a mediator without even realizing it. I softened his parents' demands, I balanced their expectations, and I created space for everyone to coexist. But I see now that I enabled a dynamic in which they assumed we'd absorb any burden they handed us. I thought they saw me as family. They saw me as leverage. The more I reflected, the clearer their motives became. Thomas saw the $54,000 as something he deserved, payment for the years he believed he'd given to raising his son. Elaine saw it as emotional compensation for all her imagined suffering. Neither intended to repay it. To them, repayment was merely a comforting phrase, a soothing promise to offer until the pressure passed. But their motives didn't make their actions justified. If anything, understanding them made their betrayal colder. This wasn't desperation. This was entitlement fueled by habit. And then there was David. He wasn't malicious, just conflict-averse to a fault. He thought hiding the truth would spare me stress. He thought he could fix it quietly. But by trying to protect me, he unwittingly betrayed me too. I loved him. I still do. But that doesn't absolve him. Their motives were predictable. But what wasn't predictable, what came as a true shock, was what I uncovered next. I began reviewing their emergency needs, digging into the timeline David mentioned, matching dates with expenses, searching public records, reviewing credit bureau entries they had inadvertently triggered through shared accounts. And that's when I discovered that the Ellisons didn't just borrow from us. They had borrowed from others. Repeatedly. Slowly. Systematically. $54,000 wasn't the first time. It was just the first time someone had the means to expose them. I approached the investigation the way a seasoned woman approaches anything important, with patience, organization, and a refusal to rush. I started with documents. Nothing confrontational, just quiet review. David, guilty and still swimming in remorse, didn't resist when I asked him to gather bank statements, emails, and text messages relating to his parents. He printed everything and placed it on the dining table like a man turning himself in. I read through every transfer. Every vague message from his mother. "We're in trouble again. We don't know what to do. Don't tell Maggie, she'll just worry." That phrase showed up more than once. Don't tell Maggie. I realized then that this wasn't just dishonesty directed at me. It was collusion. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront David. I simply asked questions. When exactly were they behind on the mortgage? He hesitated. They said last spring. I pulled property tax and mortgage records, public documents. Their payments were consistent. On time. Not a single delinquency. When did Dad's truck break down? David frowned. He said he didn't have the money to fix it. I pulled maintenance receipts, again public records tied to a local shop belonging to an acquaintance. The truck was serviced, yes. But more recently, Thomas had purchased a newer model. Not new, but newer. Paid in cash. I kept going. Medical emergencies? No hospital stays. No sudden surgeries. No overdue medical bills. They'd fabricated crises and softened their demands with emotional appeals. They weren't struggling. They were supplementing their lifestyle with our savings. The more evidence I gathered, the calmer I became. Anger tends to evaporate when replaced with clarity. But there was something else, something bigger. A pattern emerged across multiple bank statements. Transfers from our account, yes. But also transfers to a secondary account not previously disclosed. I followed it. It belonged to Elaine's sister, someone they claimed barely spoke to them. And when I dug further, I discovered that the sister had declared bankruptcy several years ago. Yet shortly after the transfers began, her financial situation mysteriously improved. The Ellisons weren't just borrowing. They were playing financial Robin Hood, except the stolen funds weren't going to the poor. They were going to family members who had a knack for living beyond their means. The final blow came when I found evidence of a personal loan the Ellisons had taken out and defaulted on, resulting in a judgment that they'd successfully avoided paying because they moved assets through relatives. It was all documented, all verifiable. This was no misunderstanding. This was a financial pattern spanning years. When I finished compiling everything, I placed the documents into 3 folders. Folder 1, evidence of the $54,000 transfers. Folder 2, evidence of fabricated emergencies. Folder 3, evidence of additional financial misconduct. I stared at them for several minutes. The weight of those folders represented not just money, but years of manipulation wrapped in the language of family loyalty. But I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. And I wanted to protect the life David and I had built, a life they had quietly siphoned. That's when I made my decision. I wouldn't threaten them. I wouldn't involve the police. And I wouldn't scream or argue or demand apologies. Instead, I would use the power of documentation and the systems already in place for people who take what isn't theirs. I didn't choose a collection agency lightly. I researched extensively, comparing reputations, legal compliance, and success rates. Eventually, I selected one that specialized in recovering personal loans with written or demonstrable evidence. When the representative answered the phone, her voice was crisp and professional. "How can we help you today?" I explained the situation with calm precision. Personal funds transferred under explicit promises of repayment, supported by written communication and verifiable bank activity. "We can certainly assist," she said. "Do you have documentation?" "I have everything," I replied. And I emailed over the 3 folders. 2 days later, she called back, almost impressed. "Mrs. Ellison, this is extremely thorough. Based on this, we can pursue full repayment, including fees and any reasonable interest accrued." I thanked her, but what she said next told me everything I needed to know about the road ahead. "Just to be clear, once we begin, you must avoid personal contact about the debt. Let us handle it." That suited me perfectly. The agency prepared formal notices, delivered them both electronically and through certified mail. When the Ellisons received the first notice, the explosion was inevitable. Elaine called me 17 times in one afternoon. I didn't answer. David's phone lit up too, but I asked him not to engage. He struggled with that, torn between loyalty and guilt, but he complied. Then Thomas left a voicemail, angry, indignant, as predictable as thunder after lightning. You think you can sick collectors on your own family? How could you do this, Maggie? We said we'd pay you back. But that was the truth. They said it. They didn't mean it. The collection agency informed me the Ellisons first tried denial, then minimization, then outrage, then bargaining. But the evidence was airtight, and the debt was legally enforceable. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt steady, resolved. 1 week later, the agency uncovered something else. Thomas and Elaine had recently received a sizable payout from a small inheritance on Thomas's side of the family. It wasn't huge, around $20,000, but they had not disclosed it to anyone. In fact, they had used a portion of it to make household upgrades and purchase a used SUV for Elaine's sister. The agency froze the remaining accessible funds through legal channels. And suddenly, the Ellisons understood the gravity. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore. It was an enforceable debt. They tried reaching out again, this time with frantic politeness. Maggie, dear, can we talk? Maggie, we never meant for it to come to this. Maggie, let's be adults. But I had been an adult the entire time. They were simply experiencing the discomfort of accountability for the first time. When the agency informed me that the Ellisons were now looking into payment options to avoid further legal consequences, I felt no joy, just quiet relief. And maybe a little sadness. The truth had fully unfolded. They hadn't needed help. They hadn't been honest. They hadn't valued our future. They had used us because they assumed they could. And now the system they believed they were above was gently, professionally, legally holding them to the very promise they'd waved away as casually as a breeze. The confrontation wasn't planned. It happened by coincidence, though part of me believes it was inevitable. David and I were pulling into the driveway after running errands when Thomas and Elaine drove up behind us. They stepped out of their vehicle with urgency, determination, and poorly disguised panic. Elaine rushed forward. Maggie, please, just hear us out. Thomas followed with a sterner approach. We need to settle this like adults, without outsiders involved. I turned to them, my demeanor calm, almost serene. It's already being settled, I said. Through the proper channels. Elaine's face crumpled into dramatic distress. We didn't think you'd do this to us. I didn't do anything, I replied. You took money that wasn't yours and never paid it back. A collection agency is a reasonable solution. Thomas bristled. We said we'd pay it back. You didn't have to embarrass us. Accountability isn't embarrassment, I said softly. It's fairness. David stood beside me, guilt heavy on his shoulders. But he didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend them. For once. I don't understand why you're being so cold, Elaine said. We're family. Family doesn't hide things, I said. Or lie. Or manipulate. Or ask for help while living comfortably off someone else's savings. Her eyes flickered, shock mixed with recognition. She hadn't expected clarity. She had expected emotional weakness. Thomas tried a different tactic. You're tearing this family apart over money. No, I said quietly. Your choices did that. Silence fell. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then Elaine whispered, We didn't think you'd actually follow through. And that was the truest thing she had ever said to me. They were banking on my silence, my politeness, my history of smoothing things over. They had miscalculated. I stepped closer, my tone firm but controlled. I need you both to understand something. This isn't vengeance. This isn't cruelty. This is consequences for actions you took with full knowledge of what you were doing. Elaine's tears spilled, not the soft tears of regret, but the sharp ones of someone realizing their usual tools were useless. Maggie, please, she whispered. Just drop the agency. We'll start paying you something. No, I said. This process will continue until the debt is resolved. Thomas clenched his jaw. We don't deserve this. I held his gaze. You deserve exactly the agreement you made. There was no shouting, no dramatics, just truth laid bare. And when they finally left, angry, shaken, but utterly defeated, David turned to me with eyes full of sorrow. I'm so sorry, he said. I should have protected you. I shook my head. No, you just need to do better moving forward. He nodded, understanding that forgiveness wasn't free. It required change. Inside the house, I felt something inside me settle. Not happiness. Accountability is rarely happy, but the restoration of internal order. I was no longer the woman people used for convenience. I was the woman who expected consequences arrived quietly at first: letters, adjustments, structured repayment plans. Then they arrived all at once. The collection agency succeeded in freezing a portion of the Ellisons' accessible funds and securing a legally binding repayment agreement for the full $54,000 plus administrative fees. They would be repaying us for several years. It was fair. It was reasonable. It was exactly what they had promised from the start. But Thomas and Elaine didn't handle it well. They blamed the collection agency. Then they blamed the legal process. Then they blamed me. For weeks, they kept their distance. David called them occasionally, but I could hear strained pauses on the other end. Trust, once shattered, doesn't rebuild easily, especially when it was built on illusion to begin with. Eventually, I received a letter from Elaine. Handwritten. Emotional. Full of half apologies and full denials woven together in a way only she could do. She said she was sorry if I felt hurt. She said they didn't intend things to get this serious. She said family should be above money. I didn't respond. Accountability isn't cruelty. But forgiveness without accountability is enabling. And I was done enabling. Meanwhile, David changed more quietly. He'd always been gentle, conflict-averse. But he'd watched the consequences of silence and learned. We began attending financial planning meetings together, discussing everything openly. His shame slowly shifted into responsibility. He apologized again, not with words alone but with actions, transparency, initiative, boundaries I had never seen him enforce before. He told his parents gently but firmly that all financial matters needed to go through both of us. That there would be no more secret transfers. That transparency was a requirement, not a request. The Ellisons reacted with wounded theatrics. They accused me of turning their son against them. But David stood his ground. For the first time in his life. The repayment process continued smoothly. Each month, the agency collected its installments. Each month, a small piece of our financial stability returned. And as strange as it may sound, I began to feel lighter. We weren't rich, but we were safe again. We weren't perfect, but we were honest again. And the Ellisons, well, they were accountable. Consequences didn't destroy the family. They simply reordered it. But the final resolution, the moment I felt true closure, came on an afternoon several months later when a representative from the collection agency called me personally. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "I wanted to inform you that the debt is officially current and all installments have begun without issue. Based on their plan, you will receive full repayment, with all associated fees, within 32 months. "Thank you," I said. And she replied, "If I may say so, your documentation made this one of the cleanest cases we've ever handled." When the call ended, I felt a quiet pride. Not vindictiveness, not even satisfaction. Just pride in having stood up for myself in a way I hadn't always known how to do. I'm 62 years old, and if there is one thing life has taught me, it's that family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by responsibility, truth, and reciprocity. When the Ellisons took our money, they didn't just break financial trust, they broke relational trust. And when they lied about their emergencies, they didn't just manipulate the situation, they manipulated our kindness. But this experience didn't make me bitter. If anything, it purified something in me. It taught me that boundaries are not walls. They are doors that open and close with purpose. They protect what matters. I've had people ask me if I regret involving a collection agency, if I wish I had given the Ellisons more time, more chances, more emotional cushioning. My answer is simple. No. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is require accountability. Sometimes the only way to teach someone they cannot take advantage of others is to let them face the systems designed for exactly that. I didn't scream. I didn't insult them. I didn't wage a personal war. I simply documented the truth and allowed the truth to speak louder than their excuses. The debt is being repaid. Our future is protected. And David and I have built stronger communication than we ever did before this crisis. His guilt transformed into growth. My silence transformed into strength. As for the Ellisons, they are quieter now. More reserved. They still call occasionally, but the dynamic has changed. The entitlement has faded. The manipulation has dissolved into wary respect. I don't know if our relationship will ever fully recover. But I do know this. You cannot control how others behave. You can only control how you respond. And dignity is a powerful response. I look back now and realize that the real story wasn't about money. It was about awakening, about reclaiming agency, about understanding that being kind does not mean being a doormat. Revenge, in my world, is not about hurting someone. It's about revealing the truth so clearly that it can no longer be denied. It's about justice, calm, measured, legal, and fair. And that is exactly what happened. If you're listening to this and you've been taken advantage of by someone you trusted, whether it's family, friends, or partners, I want you to remember something. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to use the tools available to you. And you are allowed to demand fairness without guilt. You do not owe your silence to anyone. Now, before I end my story, let me ask you something. The same question I asked myself during the darkest part of this ordeal. If someone took advantage of your kindness, would you confront them? Would you hold them accountable? Or would you remain silent and hope things change on their own? I know my answer now. What's yours?